What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Bass Fishing Declassified. In this video, I'm going to share the 3 rules of winter bass fishing. Let's get into it. Rule number 1 of winter bass fishing is fish the extreme depths, both shallow and deep. I think a lot of anglers have a misconception about how deep bass set up in the winter time. Most of the time, I feel like anglers are focused on fishing that 10 to 30 foot of water range in the winter. However, I find that I catch 90% of my winter bass in either less than 8 feet of water or 40 feet of water and deeper. I feel like both of these depth zones get overlooked by anglers, but for different reasons. On the shallower side, less than 8 feet of water, I think a lot of anglers think that the water temps are too cold for the fish to be setting up in that shallow water. But even on lakes that have extremely clear water, 5, 6, 7, 8 feet of visibility, the fish will still be up at times in less than 8 feet of water. And if you have a nice cloudy, windy day, those fish will move up against steeper rock banks, around bluff walls and things like that, and be setting up within 8 feet of the surface or against the bank in 8 feet of water or less. The main key is that these fish are not going to be living in that 0 to 8 foot range day in and day out. A lot of times they're going to be suspended off the bank, kind of roaming out in the middle of the lake for the majority of the day and pull up into that shallower water zone for a few hours every day. This again could be based on the wind, the sky conditions. A lot of times earlier in the morning, the fish will actually set up shallower even though it's colder in the morning, and that's just due to the low light. And they'll also move up in the afternoon when you have sunny skies and the water temps at the top of the water column start to warm up. This is especially effective on lakes that have more stained water, let's say a foot to 4 foot of visibility. A lot of times that sun is going to warm up the water again in that top half of the water column, and you might find that the water deeper is 45 to 50 degrees and the water right at the surface is 50 to 53 degrees. And so those fish feel more comfortable moving up into those shallow water areas in the winter as the afternoon progresses. Now on the opposite end of the spectrum, I find a lot of bass in 40 feet of water or deeper, especially in lakes that have clear water. In general, I'm looking for lakes with 3 to 4 foot of visibility whenever I'm trying to fish in 40 feet of water or deeper. If the lake has less than 3 foot of visibility, I'll spend the majority of my time in that 0 to 8 foot range, and I hardly ever venture past 40 feet just because the water isn't clear enough to allow sun to penetrate that deep. But if you do have 3+ feet of visibility on your lake, there will be bass that set up 40, 50, 60, even 70 feet deep in the winter time. Most of the time I'm finding these fish actually on the bottom of the lake in 40 feet. They're not suspended, chasing around out in the middle of the lake. They're actually dead on the bottom. They're not dead, they're alive, but they're sitting on the bottom of the lake with their bellies in the bottom. And I can see this on forward-facing sonar, on down imaging 2D sonar, but also you'll be surprised at how many fish I catch in the winter that I bring up that have mud on their bellies because they're literally sitting on the bottom of the lake. You won't find as many fish that are doing this in that 10 to 30 foot range. And for years I would graph offshore trying to find fish in the winter on these clear water lakes and not finding hardly any in that like 10 to 30 foot zone. But after I started fishing deeper than that, 40+ feet of water, I would find massive groups of fish. And I've had 30, 40, 50, 60 fish days in the wintertime catching fish that are literally on the bottom of the lake in 45, 50 feet of water, on jigging spoons, on Demiki rigs, things like that. Now I was doing this with 2D sonar where you just kind of had the cone on the front of the boat and you're dropping down looking at the squiggly spaghetti lines, but now you can also do it with forward-facing sonar as well. I do think that this is a part of the water column that is becoming more popular with anglers now that they have forward-facing sonar, but a lot of guys are still chasing fish that are suspended out in the middle of the lake on balls of bait fish, and they're not looking for those fish that are right on the bottom of the lake. So my recommendation is if you are going to fish in the winter, focus on the extreme depth ranges, 0 to 8 feet or 40 feet and deeper. Rule number 2 of winter fishing is find heat, find the bass. In general, if you can find an area with some type of cover that absorbs sunlight and absorbs the heat from the sun, you're going to find more bass. This is usually in the form of some type of rock cover, whether that's riprap, actual natural occurring rock. Sometimes you can find bridge pilings, all kinds of stuff that is made of rock that will absorb heat. And even if you're not fishing the rock itself, if you can find an area that has rock in it with like a brush pile or a stump on it, or maybe some grass that is growing around a rocky area, you're going to find more bass. I would say a lot of times I'm not actually fishing the rock itself to catch the fish. The fish are actually setting up in a taller piece of cover, again, brush piles, thicker grass that's growing out deeper on some of these lakes, or just stumps. But that rock is what's going to absorb the heat and keep those fish there, especially in that 0 to 8 foot range I talked about earlier. As you get deeper than that, in that 40 plus foot of water range, the sun doesn't penetrate that deep as much, so it's not as big of a deal to find the rock. But if you're fishing in that 0 to 8 foot range, rock is absolutely critical. And if your lake doesn't have a lot of rock, then any rock you can find is usually going to hold a lot of fish. One great example of this is on the Arkansas River. Lake Dardanelle is part of the Arkansas River, and I catch a lot of fish fishing man-made riprap that is in less than 8 feet of water in the winter. And I've had days where the water temps have been 38 degrees, and I'm catching them on a crankbait on riprap because it's the only really type of cover that will absorb heat. And so in the afternoon, those fish will be attracted to those rocks because the water temp will be a degree or two warmer than the rest of the river. And even though that water temp is super cold, 38, 39 degrees, just that small change in that water temperature will attract those fish to those areas. The same thing applies if you have naturally occurring rock. If you can find a big flat that's in less than 8 feet of water with some isolated rock piles, that will draw a ton of bass as well as shad and crawfish to those areas. And it is going to be a congregating point for all kinds of forage and the bass, which makes them really great targets to kind of isolate in that winter time, because a lot of times anglers aren't going to be focused on the flatter areas with isolated rock piles. They'll be focused again on the riprap, on the bluff walls, things like that. Or they're going to be trying to fish in that like 10 to 30 foot of water range and fishing rock piles that are too deep, honestly. So if you can get away from the crowd a little bit, find a flat that's in 4 to 8 foot of water and find a rock pile on it, you are going to crush them. And I have so many videos on my YouTube channel, Fish at the Moment, where I'm catching them on rock piles with crankbaits, jerkbaits, and jigs in 4 to 8 foot of water on lakes with a foot of water visibility to lakes with 10 feet of water visibility. This isn't really a water clarity thing, it's more of a warmth and heat situation. So the warmer the area is, or at least the area that has objects like rock that can hold as much heat as possible, are going to hold the most fish in the wintertime. Rule number 3 of winter fishing is beware of 45-degree water. 45-degree water is kind of the cutoff point where shad can thrive in the winter time. If the water temperature drops below 45 degrees, you're going to have shad kills or shad die-offs, where basically the shad will get stunned by how cold it is, they'll float to the surface and they'll start to die off. This a lot of times doesn't happen until later in the winter, January or February, but depending on how the weather is throughout the year, if you get a really bad cold spell, even in December, water temperatures can drop quickly down to that 40, 42, 43 degree range, and a lot of those shad are going to be stunned and die. The issue with this is that these shad become very easy prey for the bass, and they can just kind of swim around as much as they want, eating these stunned shad, and it's just like a buffet for the bass. And so even though this is a great way to find an area with lots of bass, it's almost impossible to get them to bite because it's so easy for them to eat. They have no real incentive to like chase a bait down. They just can swim around and open their mouth, and wherever they go, they can get shad in their mouth. So my recommendation is, if at all possible, try to avoid water temperatures that are 45 degrees or less. It's not always going to be possible, and there's going to be days where your entire lake is that water temperature. And in those situations, your best bet is to throw a bait like a jerk bait that basically can suspend in the middle of the water column. And you work that bait down there, and you're going to want to let it sit there on long pauses. When I say a long pause, I mean 10 to 15 second pauses. You want to just let that bait sit and sit and sit and sit. And that is going to be one way to get those fish to actually eat your bait. They will just basically be swimming around randomly. You're not going to get a ton of bites, but you don't want to make that fish chase your bait. You just want to put an easy meal right in front of them. The other option is finding areas that don't have a lot of shad. So if you have 45 degree water or less, If there's no shad in the area, you don't see any shad dying on the surface, that's actually maybe a good thing because that means there's not an easy meal for the bass. And instead, if you can find some shallow rock that may have crawfish in it, those bass might be feeding on those crawfish in the winter as opposed to the shad, and you can catch those fish on crankbaits and jigs a lot easier. So if you do have to fish in that 45-degree water or less, look for areas without a lot of shad, or if worst comes to worst, throw that jerkbait and fish it on a 10-15 second pause. The best option is if you find 45-degree water on your lake, let's say it's 43, 44 degrees, run to different parts of your lake. A lot of times, if you go to an area with more stained water or clearer water, you may find that the water has different water temperatures. So a lot of times, if you just had a big cold front, the more dirty, stained water will cool down quicker. So you'll find that the water temps will be colder in the stained to dirty water sections of your lake right after the temperatures drop, where the water in the clear section of the lake is going to take longer to drop in temperature. So you might find that the water temps on the clear end are 47 degrees, while the water temperatures on the dirty end are 44, 43 degrees. Now, the same thing applies when the temperatures have been really cold for a long time, then start to warm up. It's actually not the same, it's the opposite. So if the water temperatures are really cold, and they have been cold, like 44, 45 degrees throughout the entire lake, but the air temperatures start to rise and you get some nice sunny skies, you'll find that the dirtier water will warm up quicker than the clear water. So if you have a situation where the lower end is 43-degree water temperature and the upper end where the dirty water is 42-degree water temperature, after some really warm days, you'll find that maybe a week later, the upper end where the dirty water is maybe 47 or 48 degrees, where the lower end where the clear water is maybe only increase a degree or two and it's still at 45-degree water temps. So by changing the section of lake you're in based on the weather conditions you've had will allow you to get away from that kind of shad kill water temperature range. And I really would recommend trying to avoid that range if at all possible. You can also find areas where maybe there's like a hot water discharge area that discharges into your lake. At some lakes that happens, where there's power plants and stuff that dump warmer water in. Maybe there's just certain creeks that have warmer water temperatures in general, just because of the way the lake sets up, or maybe it doesn't get as much runoff, or it's a little bit deeper. It's really hard to tell exactly what's happening on your specific body of water, but definitely try to run around your entire lake in the winter if you find that your temperatures are less than 45 degrees, because you're going to spend more time running around, yes, but it's gonna make fishing so much easier in the winter, and it'll turn a miserable day of fishing into one where you're actually getting quite a few bites. So those are the 3 rules of winter bass fishing. I know it's not quite winter yet in most regions of the country, but I want to get ahead with this video to give you guys some food for thought as we move into this winter time of the year. It can be a great time to catch both numbers and really big fish. And going back to rule number 1, I will say if you have that clear water on your lake, you're going to catch a pile of fish in that 40+ foot of water range, and you can catch a lot of numbers. If you're fishing in that 0 to 8 foot range, you're usually not going to get as many numbers, but you can catch some really, really big fish. So it's a great time of year to go out and fish if you want to kind of bundle up, put a bunch of clothes on, and get out there and fight the elements. It can be some of the best fishing of the year, so definitely check it out. And hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. We'll see you on the next one.